So we've talked quite a bit about the Teutonic-Class, and as we wrap up, having talked about the Teutonic and the Majestic, as well as the engineering characteristics of the class as a whole, I figured it's time to take a look at their interior layout, particularly from a passenger's perspective. So, as I mentioned in the past, the Teutonic and her sister had three classes, first, second, and third class, being some of the first white starliners to have three classes, and that really dictated the way they were laid out. In fact, if you're familiar with the way these classes are laid out on more modern liners like Titanic, you'll be fairly familiar with the way they're laid out here. You have steerage at the bow and the stern, the first class being right in the center where the ship's most stable, and the second class being behind them, actually having a separate section of superstructure. But let's get into some of the more nitty-gritty details with the way these ships are laid out. Now, the lowest decks on the ships would obviously be dedicated to engineering equipment, including the boiler rooms and engineering spaces designed for maintaining and operating the ship's engines. But as we move up, let's talk more about the passenger spaces on the ship. The lowest deck that would be available to passengers is simply called the lower deck, and it would be the lowest row of portholes above the waterline. At the forward section of this deck would be accommodations for steerage-class passengers, third-class passengers, who were bunked in large bunking spaces as opposed to individual cabins. So they would have had a large open space with a lot of bunks, sort of dormitory-style bunking, if you're familiar with that, as opposed to individual cabins. At the aft end of that segment, there's a bulkhead that separates the steerage-class areas of the ship from the first class. This area would have been primarily first-class cabins, where first-class passengers would have gone to obviously sleep. It's also worth noting that at the back end of this segment of first-class accommodations is the bottom of the first-class stairwell. Unlike the Olympic class many years later, there was only one first-class stairwell on the ship, located just behind the first funnel. This stairwell would have run through all of the first-class spaces of the ship and served as a main thoroughfare to get from one space to another. Aft of the stairwell would have been accommodations for crew, most notably firemen, as this is now basically right above the boiler rooms and easily accessible to crew members. Aft of that engineering space would be accommodations for stewards, and then aft of that would be a small section of cabins for second-class passengers, with the very last compartment on this deck being more dormitory-style bunking for third class. Moving up a deck to the second passenger deck, which would be the second row of portholes above the waterline and the highest row of portholes on the vessel. Starting up at the front, you have some accommodations for crew, but more dormitory-style bunking for third-class passengers, which dominate these forward few compartments. Aft of that, however, actually fairly forward in the ship, is the bulkhead that separates that from the beginning of the first-class sections of the ship, where there are more first-class cabins. This is actually where a majority of the first-class cabins are at this section on this deck. Aft of that would be the first-class saloon. The large dining saloon is one of the largest interior spaces on the ship, and the sort of center point for the first-class passengers on board, located basically amidships right between the two funnels on this deck. After that, the ship is sort of divided in half by a passageway, where on one side you have more accommodations for first-class passengers, while on the other side you have the galley and kitchen equipment. Moving aft from that, you have more spaces dedicated to your second-class passengers. This is primarily second-class cabins, with the last two compartments of the ship being more dormitory-style bunking for third-class passengers. This brings us up to the promenade deck here, which is the sort of space on top of the hull. You have, in the forecastle, some accommodations mostly for crew, with some minor passenger spaces like restrooms up there. And then this open well-deck space, which would primarily be utilized by third-class passengers, before you get to the first-class sections of the ship, being this main promenade area here. In that area, you have more staterooms for first-class passengers, as well as a cut-through for the dome that is on top of the large dining saloon, which was particularly lavish. But as you move to the stern section of the superstructure, things get a little bit more interesting. This is where you find the smoking room, which is a popular place for gentlemen to hang out after dinner on board. Moving aft from that, you have more engineering space for funnel uptakes and engineering work involving these funnels. And then that leads you to this aft section of superstructure here, sort of separate from everything else, and that's the second-class section of the superstructure, which houses the second-class dining saloon. This is where second-class passengers would have gone to be served their meals. Moving into the very stern of the ship, you have more engineering spaces and a few open spaces for third-class passengers, and at the very stern you have the ship's steering gear. Now, there is one more deck above this, but unfortunately I was not able to find any deck plans for what was on this deck. Another thing that was notably absent from these deck plans was a dining room for steerage-class passengers. Now, that's because on ships of the day, they likely were eating in their bunks or in the open spaces provided to them, as opposed to having a dedicated dining room, which would become more common on later ships. Now, we do know that in those upper spaces on that last deck, which once again I couldn't find deck plans for, there were things like a library for first-class passengers, as well as the officers' quarters that would have served as sort of the main focal point for the ship's deck officers, who were, the captain and his command crew. And on top of all of that, the last deck of the ship and the highest accessible point on the ship in general regular operations, with exception of the crow's nest, is the ship's bridge, and I shouldn't need to explain what a ship's bridge does. All in all, that rounds out the Teutonic-Class. If you'd like to learn more about the stories of these ships, or what made them so unique from an engineering perspective, I'll leave a link up here to a playlist I've built all about the Teutonic-Class, so you can learn more about these two historic ships. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Barbettes and Binnacles, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.